Greetings. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion, the time where we set about to factor the truth of God's Word into our lives and hopefully your lives as well. We are currently in our study through the Gospel of Luke, and we want to thank you for your interest in such a study. I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and Paul's going to tell you how you can participate in today's discussion.
If you're watching this live video on Facebook Live, all you need to do is just comment below the video window. But if you happen to be on live.truthfactor.com, we have a chat window there, and you need to sign in either using social media or just as a guest. If you'll do that, then you can make your comments, you can ask questions. We try to introduce those in a timely fashion as we go through the lesson. And if we have your comment a little out of place, we didn't intend to do that. Sometimes we get in the middle of a discussion. It's hard for us to go back and pick that up. But we'll try real hard to get that in the order in which it needs to be.
All righty. I appreciate that, Paul. Bear with me just a moment. We've got a minor hiccup here. There we go. And trying to figure out all right, Tom, if you would go ahead and let everybody know where we are going to begin, and I'll have the Bible up here in just a second.
All right, okay, we're studying in Luke chapter 14, and basically we're going to begin with verse number 15 now. And the occasion is most of chapter 14 is dealing with a single event. Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, and was typically the case, that brought about some criticism or if nothing else, looks as Jesus was doing this, because many of the religious leaders objected to that. So Jesus, after challenging them, he begins to tell this parable about dealing with humility. How when a feast is given, you take the lower seat so that you can possibly be elevated to a higher seat, rather than taking the higher seat and somebody greater than you comes along and you're humiliated as the giver of the feast asks you to move. And then after that, and that brings us to verse number 15, where Jesus tells another parable, and it's we're still dealing with this great supper and some parables that are associated with that, but Jesus takes this in a different direction. So we're going to go ahead and read Luke chapter 14, verses 15 through 24. And let's see, Eric, could I get you to read that for us?
Yes, let me switch over here to New King James real quick.
All right. And John, you got it up. Okay, good.
All right. And which verses again, Tom?
15 through 24.
All right. Now, when one of those who sat at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then he said to him, "A certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, 'Come, for all things are now ready.' But they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused.' And another said, 'I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to test them. I ask you to have me excused.' Still another said, 'I've married a wife, and therefore I cannot come.' So that servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind.' The servant said, 'Master, it is done as you commanded, and there is still room.' Then the master said to the servant, 'Go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper.'"
Okay, so thank you for reading that. So here we have on this occasion, Jesus has again talked about humility, and and not being so concerned about showing off and how much greater you are in a location, and how it's easy to be knocked down. And then we have here in verse number 15, one of those who sat at the table with him, he heard these things, and he makes this statement, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." And of course, that leads to an interesting question to why is this particular statement being made? Is he trying to change the subject, as some have pointed out, or is he thinking about things concerning Jesus Christ? Any thoughts about maybe who this individual is, whether he was loyal or not to Jesus?
Tom, I kind of wondered if he's the person that's trying to kind of break the tension, maybe change the subject matter real quick. Jesus says something, and now he can jump on board. Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Not really, he's about to spawn another lesson.
Yeah. And the sad thing about that is there were so many issues with the Pharisees and the religious leaders that they could go about any direction and Jesus would have something to say and use it to challenge them because of the corruption of the leadership. And I've often wondered, I think one of the points we've made as we've gone through these studies is many of these gatherings from a standpoint of loyalty to Jesus or following Jesus were mixed gatherings. There was a combination of his disciples. There were those who were contemplating becoming his disciples, and there were the other side, the enemies, the critics, and so on. And it seems that in this environment here that we have that kind of a mix. And, and I kind of wonder, it's kind of interesting to describe it as the one trying to break the tension. That sounds like a good way to look at it. Very possibly, this is one who is he a disciple of Jesus, trying to, gear people toward that? Whatever the case is, Jesus tells this parable here, and it's about a man that gives this great supper, and he invites many. And while it's not stated in the text, obviously this is somebody of some type of prominence, somebody of some type of resources. Yeah. And, the fact that he has the means and the location to do something like this. And obviously it seems that those whom he is inviting are individuals of substance. At least the first two, you've got business dealings and so on. So here he's given the supper, inviting many, and it's time for those who are invited to come, and he sends his servants out and to invite them. Come, all things are ready now. One thing I want to note here is when this takes place, it's time. It's and what I mean by the idea of it being time is whatever invitations had been sent out previously, it's time for that. Whatever preparations should have been made ahead of time, they should have been already made, and everything should be set for this feast. So the servant says, come, for all things are now ready. The implication is they had been invited previously, and now is the day of reckoning, if you will, as far as this goes. Any thoughts on that? Anybody else?
If we're looking for a truth factoring moment, I think the man says, "Oh man, it's going to be great to eat bread and sit at the table at the kingdom of heaven," and maybe everybody wants that. Everybody, would think, "Oh man, can you imagine? I'll get to see Grandpa again," all this kind of thing. But Jesus' reply is basically, if you want to be seated at the table, you have to accept the invitation. Yeah, and I think that's the point. Maybe for us today too.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great point, Eric. And you might add to that, Jesus is asking the question, do you really want to come? Now how many people are there? And this is a soul searching thing for us, as Christians and so on. we will. Do you want to go to heaven? Yeah, absolutely. I would hope anyone professing to follow Christ wants to go to heaven when this life is over. But do we really want to go? Or are we going to make excuses putting it off? This isn't the first time in Luke's gospel that we've dealt with excuses. Luke chapter 9, the last part of Luke chapter 9 deals pretty extensively with excuses. But anyways, here we've got three individuals that begin to make these excuses. And the first one, he comes along, and incidentally, it says they all with one accord began to make excuses. And the first one says, I bought a piece of ground. I need to go see that piece of ground. I ask you to have me excused. What are your thoughts on that? Any thoughts?
Do you think, as he's discussing this here and teaching this, that he's really talking about those who would not receive the gospel, rather than, I know you had mentioned there the idea of being prepared for the last great day, but those who would not receive the gospel and they would have a reason. We've probably all had the opportunity to study the gospel with folks, and maybe they say, well, I can't do that today, or I'll come back another day and do it, or don't push me here, whatever it would be. And so all of the excuses, you lump them together. They're poor excuses, and people say that if you're going to make an excuse, one is as good as another, I suppose. But thinking about this, that he's really talking about those who would hear the gospel. There are some who observe that we may not have a right to expect that we would ever hear the gospel more than one time. Many do. Many hear the gospel over and over again. They're invited over and over again to obey the gospel. But here, as you hear that and you know what to do, when you decide to turn away from it, not to do it, but instead make excuse, that opportunity is past and will never be there again.
Yeah, I want to add to that another way of looking at this too. Paul suggested the idea that these aren't good excuses, and I believe what you meant was that they don't actually excuse you. Another way of looking at this might be they're actually great excuses. They simply don't excuse you. In other words, getting married, well, that does seem to be pretty important, but the point is you're still not excused. Or having bought land, I can understand you would want to look at that, but you're still not excused. And I think that maybe sometimes people believe that there are legitimate excuses from their faithful service to God. I know that Stephen in the chat room brings up kind of a comparison on this when he mentions, might we look at this as the guests at worship services versus those who found excuses not to attend? And it's a good comparison. I mean, that's not perhaps the ultimate intent of this parable, but it does reflect well to say a lot of times people have excuses, and they may even seem like good excuses, but in the end, there simply isn't an excuse not to serve God. There's nothing that really excuses us from that opportunity.
Yeah, and Brian, I would add to that with Stephen's question there. I think that's an example. That's an example that definitely fits into this category, but it's not all inclusive. But yeah, it serves as a perfect illustration or a modern day application of how we can be making excuses between that and serving God.
When I mentioned that I didn't think any of these were good excuses, you look at the man who's bought a piece of ground and he needs to go see it. He never saw it before he bought the ground.
Good point there. Yeah, right.
I married a wife and cannot come. That's. I'm not sure what point I can make there. But the other one,
it's the oxen.
I missed one there. Oh, the oxen. And I'm going to go test them. Well, it seems like as if there's no other time to do these things, or I bought oxen that are questionable or something. I don't know. I look at this as folks who, not someone who says, I've got pneumonia, I need to stay in bed, but folks who just want to be excused.
Yeah. And I was going to say this to the end, but we're talking about it, so we'll do it at the beginning, and then we'll just kind of briefly talk about each one of these individually. Let's just go ahead and talk about excuses in general. One of the problems we have in our society is our definition of an excuse can mean two different things. You know, an excuse can be any reason that is given for why you do not do something or why you do something, whereas there's two sides to that. You know, we oftentimes when we think of excuses, we think of that which is not the real reason versus a legitimate reason. And basically, as excuses are used in Scripture, it's typically the idea of it's not the real or a legitimate reason for doing something. You're making up an excuse. And you know, I once heard somebody define, you know, what is an excuse? You know, an excuse is a little white lie wrapped in tissue paper with a ribbon around it. and of course, the key word there is it's a lie. You know, it's a lie, and you just wrap it up and you make it look pretty and make it look acceptable. But when you come down to it, it's not a legitimate reason, which is the point. You know, the illustration was given. You know, I've got pneumonia. I'm genuinely sorry. I would like to be there, but it's just not. It's not good for me, and it's not good for you all that I be there. So with regret, I must say I can't do this. But like you said, you compare that to these other ones. How has God viewed excuses? When you look at the history of excuses in the Bible, how does God view excuses? Any thoughts?
Well, we can start with Adam and say it was the woman you gave me. We can go to Saul, who said it was Samuel's fault for being late, that he jumped the gun on the sacrifices, or it was the people's fault because they were uncontrollable. Or we can even go to the example of the man with one talent who tried to blame his master by saying his master was a harsh master and put too much fear into him. But in the end, of course, every example we have of men bringing up excuses to God as to why they weren't faithful or why they didn't obey him, every single time God rejects them.
Yeah, exactly. And with that in mind, you know, you ask the question, what excuse are you going to make when you stand before God on the day of judgment for turning down his invitation? And I think that's the great point to drive home when we deal with the subject of excuses. And this is just another one of those occasions. You know, who do you think Jesus has in mind as he is talking about this, as he gives this parable? Is he talking about all people? Is he talking about the corrupt Jewish leaders, those who were going to reject him? Is he talking about disciples who are waffling? You know, maybe they're convinced who Jesus is, but they're not ready to commit, or all of the above. John, I think you got something to say?
Yeah, hang on just a minute. Phone decided to ring.
Oh,
While
okay.
John steps away,
Yeah, I need to hire
I'll
a
jump in.
secretary.
Or is he back?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric.
I think the primary application is that the Jews in general had the golden ticket, you know, to the Willy Wonka factory. They all had their first crack at the gospel. They were the original invitees. And in these parables that had to do with, there were some who were originally invited, and then there were others who were going to be welcomed and take their place. I think the primary thing is this fact that the Jews were going to reject their invitations. They were going to, by and large, say, make excuses and say thanks, but no thanks. And then people that they would have considered much less worthy, these, you know, Gentiles, were going to find themselves seated at the table and the Jews on the outside. And I think that's the primary thing, but I think as you gave a lot of examples, Tom, it could apply to anyone in any setting who has an invitation and is trying to decide whether to accept it or to make an excuse.
Yeah, exactly. John, are you there? Are you available?
Yeah. I was going to first say what Eric said there. I do think the specific context here is very limited initially. I think he's talking about the Jews who are rejecting his message. And if we go up early in the chapter, I think we see kind of the same thought going through here. I'm not so sure that we could really apply this parable to people missing worship services. Because it's not so much that Jesus was saying these reasons aren't quality enough reasons to miss, is that these reasons are things that people are rather doing instead of listening to Him and coming into the kingdom. I mean, people do make excuses all the time, and you're right about that. But I think specifically he's talking about the Jews who were not listening to His message. They were being called into the kingdom, and they were too busy doing other things. And I think each of these is a representation of they found other things more important than following Christ.
Brian said earlier reasons for not faithfully following Jesus or following the teaching of the Word. I think that more broad explanation, as John suggested, is probably what was intended in this teaching.
Absolutely, and I'm in complete agreement with that. Where this would apply to the idea of making excuses is just looking at excuses in general, not the context as in this is the reason here, but to show somebody how God feels about excuses. I think you could apply that to any circumstance where people are making excuses. You know, the fact is God's not going to buy your excuses. So if you're making an excuse to get out of doing something that you ought to be doing, beware.
Yeah.
I see your point. Go ahead, John.
I heard something the other day that I think is a very good point, and I hadn't thought about this before, but I'll share it. If someone is making an excuse because they don't want to do it, okay, then that goes back to what you're saying. It's kind of a lie. You know, they need to, instead of making an excuse, to say, I don't want to do it. Why weren't y'all there on Sunday night? Someone says, well, we had to do this and this. Well, maybe that was legitimate. But if it was simply used as an excuse, then say, I didn't want to come. Just be very forthright. But someone the other day said, sometimes excuses begin as obstacles. And if we don't overcome the obstacles, then they become excuses. But if we have an obstacle there that we can overcome, then we defeat it before it becomes an excuse, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
At least it did at the time I heard it, so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I mean, obviously the point I would drive home is be careful when you start making excuses. And number two, ultimately, when you stand before God and answer for your life, what excuse are you going to make that, that's going to be acceptable? So beware of those things. And I'm in complete agreement. Remember, one of the points that we've made as we've been going through the study is we are well past the time where it says that Jesus set his face to go toward Jerusalem. I believe that was Luke 9. So he's well on his way. So we're dealing with what is likely the last year, maybe the last few months, or even weeks before he actually enters Jerusalem for the final time. And everything's getting more intense. And you're going to be able to read into many of the parables that Jesus gives, his challenge of these corrupt religious leaders, and how Jesus is warning over and over and over, you think you're it, but you're not. As a matter of fact, you're going to be left out because of your rebellious and rejecting attitude. And that's what we have here with these excuses. So, anything else on that? Okay. So, let's just briefly mention each of the three. I know Paul alluded to some of these a few moments ago here. You have this first one. I bought a piece of ground and I need to go see it. I ask you to have me excused. And, when I see that excuse, like Paul said, these are bad excuses. What makes this a bad excuse? Anybody?
I don't know, Tom, why do you think it's a bad excuse?
Well, I think it's a bad excuse because that piece of ground was there yesterday. Paul brought up a good point. Are you going to buy a piece of ground without looking at it first? But secondly, that piece of ground isn't going to change overnight. And let's suppose that this is their day off. and it's the only day they have. You know what? It's still going to be there next week, and it's not going to be any different. If you own the ground, chances are a week isn't going to make a whole lot of difference. So it's a bad excuse from that standpoint. There's always tomorrow. There's always a little bit later. What you're saying is that this feast is not important, and I think that's what they were all saying. So that's that one. Now, what is there any difference between that and the yoke of oxen? Because I can kind of see one slight difference, but not much. But anybody else have any thoughts? Nope. Well, I see the idea of the yoke of the oxen. I see something that's even a little more urgent than the piece of ground. I mean, this is business. Yeah, this is a business dealing, and you got to deal with these animals in a timely, to test them in a timely fashion and so on. But again, it's something that one day is not going to make all that much difference. I mean, if this is a business affair, you can arrange to take care of this tomorrow. So that would be the only difference. Maybe in a slight degree of urgency, but in both cases, they're still just excuses, and somebody really they're looking for a way to get out of coming to the feast, and that is the way that Jesus portrays it. Now, what about the third one? I have married a wife, and I cannot come.
Todd, I can't help but think about the fact that Jesus would say that we have to love him and hate our family, essentially. But I still don't know if you make a direct connection between that concept of counting the cost and this particular excuse, though.
Yeah, exactly. But now the interesting thing about the excuse here is he doesn't ask to be excused. He just makes the blunt statement, I can't come. I married a wife. Now, one thing I will say, if I remember correctly about the old law, once one got married, there was this grace period that they were supposed to spend, getting to know each other and all those types of things. And maybe we're dealing with that type of a circumstance. But again, I'm sure even if that is the circumstance that you're dealing with, would it be a situation where you couldn't go out to dinner? You couldn't go to a feast, whatever the circumstance is. So again, they're just all excuses and rejected.
I want to make one more case for the possibility that maybe, like I said, it's not so much about the idea of bad excuses, because I do kind of think that this ties into what he's about to say. John was kind of alluded to that, and I actually do think that was his point, that all of these things represent our work, our livelihood, our families, all the things that are important, things that we're obligated to have some care for. But the kingdom of heaven needs to be first. What I see here are two things linked together about the concept of priorities. That if everything else is in a distant second, then you're not worthy of the feast. And so no matter what it is, this feast should be first. This should be first above all things. And that's why I kind of think it then leads into this next point about verse 26. Yep. You're going to have to hate your father and your mother and all these other, we understand what he means by that. He means they have to be a distant second to this one thing, that this one thing has to be everything you're about. And it doesn't matter, as I said, it doesn't matter what we put forward. And like I said, we're kind of thinking, I know we use a lot of conversation about ideas of things that might excuse us from worship, but as we've already said, this isn't about worship. This is about pursuing Christ.
Right.
And ultimately, what we understand is there's absolutely nothing that excuses us from pursuing Christ. There's absolutely nothing that really gets in that way. So even things that we might think of as legitimate, my family, my work, we can throw a lot of things in here, my disabilities, my inabilities. Stephen actually brings something up here too about some of the issues of the poor and the crippled. But the point is, nothing can get in that way. And I think that's what ties this passage to the next one.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea of rejecting. And with that in mind, because we're just from a time standpoint, looking at the second half of this, these excuses are made. And of course, the servant reports it to the master, and he says, go out into the streets in the city and bring in the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. And in our show prep, it was actually brought up that this is the same category that you read about in verse number 15. When you give the feast, invite those that can't pay you back. And what connection is there between the two? I don't know. Other than the fact that these are the ones who are unable to, these are the ones that are unable to repay you back. And in this case, these are the ones who may be, unable to, to afford what maybe should have been what you would think with those of your own class, those of the higher class, and so on. So actually, you're being generous in helping these people, and those that the upper society sometimes looks down upon in disdain, and which is the ultimate point. The Pharisees looked down on the poor of society, and they look down on the Gentiles and so on. But yet here Jesus says, go get the poor and the lame and the blind, and the master and the servant does, and comes back. There's still room. Go out into the hidden places and find everybody that you can and just bring them in, because those who were initially invited rejected me, and they're not going to get one scrap of what is offered here. Now, it was mentioned going into our comments. Stephen James did have a good comment. This was alluded to a moment ago. Can you pull those up, John, or do you want me to just read them?
You want to start where he says the excuses?
Yeah, the excuses.
Yep, you go right ahead.
Yeah, and does somebody else want to read these, or?
You're doing good.
Okay. So here we have Stephen James. He says the excuses seem representative of all excuses. The poor, the crippled, and the blind surely had good excuses as well, but they attended none the less. And that's a very great point. Here you have people that have struggles and difficulties. They have to go through some obstacles to get there, but yet they're willing to come. And so that's a good point. And then Eric goes on, maybe they didn't, or at least maybe they didn't have as many built-in excuses, which come from the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches. Another good point to observe in that. And then Eric goes on and says, there may be an implication that those who are prosperous and doing fine are less likely to see the urgency of the gospel compared to those who are in distress and in need. And I think that's always been the case. I think that's why Jesus, thank the Father that you have not revealed this to the upper crust, but to basically the common man. And basically and generally it was the common man that accepted Jesus, even though there are certainly exceptions, and there's exceptions of accepting and rejecting. But it was typically the common man, the one who, because he didn't have so much of this world's goods, saw the hope beyond this life. So that's what we have here. Stephen makes the observation, complacency can be very hazardous. And then finally, Steve Hutchinson, it's good to have him with us a couple of weeks ago. He said that they are more appreciative, which is important, as we can ascertain from the Beatitudes. And another good observation to be there, the Beatitudes begin with the idea of being poor in spirit. Those who realize they're standing before God and so on. So that's some good comments there. Any other thoughts going all the way through verse 24?
As we think about it, Tom, we might consider those that we preach to today, that it's not always those who have their lives all together, who come from a neighborhood like we come from, who have a house or a car like we have. It may be that those who will hear the gospel are those who have wrecked their lives. You would look at them and say they are a disaster, and they realize how much they need to be saved.
Yeah, exactly. And how many of us, quite honestly, the soul-searching question, how many of us are willing to go down to Skid Row? Or maybe that person when you're walking into Walmart or the restaurant and they're asking for a handout. How many of us will take a moment to stop and talk to them and Give them a card, invite them to services, or see what you can do to help them. I mean, is it? I know it's something I can work on. And are we more afraid? Are we more afraid of inviting them, or are we more afraid that maybe they will accept the invitation? and then what do we got to deal with? So I mean, it's an interesting thought with soul searching. So, anything else dealing with this particular parable? Okay, if not, let's go ahead and try to get through this. We have got about 20 minutes left. In verses 25 through 35, Jesus basically teaches either on this same occasion, it says great multitudes went with him, or a time shortly thereafter. So let me get somebody to read these verses for me. Let's see, Paul, you want to read?
I can do that. What verse to start and end?
Yeah, 25 through the end of the chapter.
Okay. Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
Okay, thank you. So here we have Jesus, and like I said, whether it's that occasion or shortly thereafter or something, multitudes are with him, following him, and he turns around and he gives this, what I would describe as a shocking statement there, using this word, he who comes after me and doesn't hate his father and mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And Jesus is using strong language here. And again, I want to just remember, we're getting closer and closer to the time. Everything's getting more intense. And so that's what's happening here as Jesus uses this very, very strong language. And there's two words that stand out in here that we need to give consideration to. The first one is the word hate, and the second word is the word cannot. So what are your thoughts about the point that Jesus is making here? First of all, is he literally telling us he wants us to hate our family?
Yes.
Okay, explain.
All right. You can only love one. You cannot love two.
So
you
you're
must choose one over the other.
Exactly. So you're talking priority. And what I mean by that is I heard a sermon one time, and I've actually started preaching this. We sometimes talk about getting our priorities straight. In reality, there's one priority.
Well,
what is your priority? But go ahead. Yeah.
You're right. I mean, many times, and I know I've said this before in the past, we'll say, well, this means to love less. We have to love Christ more and love everybody else less. And I don't believe that's his point. As in everything that we've seen within this chapter, the call to the supper, the willingness to listen to him, you've got to make and Brian, I think, said this earlier, it is all him or nothing. Right. And people who are making up excuses and everything, it's got to be you love Christ and no one else. Not hatred in the way that we might think of hatred, but think about a husband trying to have two women in his life. He's going to hate one and ultimately despise the other one. He's going to love one and despise the other. You don't have enough affection to truly love both, and you don't have enough affection to truly love Christ and everybody else. If you're lucky or fortunate, I'm not sure what the right word is, you'll never face a moment in your life where you have to make that decision. But if you have to make the decision, you've got to choose. If you love Christ, you'll choose him always.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And you bring up a thought based on the way you worded that. I was going to ask the question, what is your definition of hate? Because that is a challenge when we consider what that word means, especially in our society. When you think of hating something, you think of, you hate something, you despise them, you treat them hatefully. And obviously, that's not what you have in mind, and that's not the point Jesus is making.
Maybe a comparison might be to, ask yourself, what is darkness? Darkness is the absence of light, all right? So, imagine a scenario where you have one light, and there's no in-between. You have utter darkness, you turn on the light, you no longer have darkness. Maybe that's kind of what it's looking for. We think about love in a very emotional way, in a compassionate way, but I'm not sure if Christ is intending that. I think that love there is a wife to a husband and nobody else.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing about it is we have to grasp what is meant by hate here. And I know the reason people say love less, and I still kind of lean toward that from the standpoint, but I see your point. It's the fact that Jesus is one of the first ones to teach the importance of loving your spouse. He's one of the first ones to teach about what it means to be a good parent. And he showed love for that, and siblings and all those types of things. But obviously, the whole point that he's driving home there is if you pick me, if you follow me, you're going to have to completely and totally follow me. And if you're faced with a decision, you have to choose me. I like the illustration that you gave about a man cheating on his wife, or a man faced with the opportunity of another woman. If he goes with that other woman, he might say, I love both women. Not really. And, like you make the point, if you love your wife, you'll keep your vow to your wife. Period. If you follow somebody else, you've broken that vow. And clearly your actions show that you do not love her.
Yeah.
And that's the point. So that might be the way to look at the love versus hate. Is hatred is not loving. The opposite of actually loving something. Yeah. So anyways, any other thoughts on that? Okay, Stephen has an observation, and then I'm going to get to Brian here in a minute, in verse 27. Stephen says, it appears that Christ is saying, choosing him will be very difficult, number one, or number two, think carefully about what you must do, because it may cost you everything. And number three, commit to God with all your being, and not or, but it's all of those are ands. So, choose him is not going to be easy. And number two, so think carefully about it, and we're going to get into that. And number three, to commit to God with everything that you have. And again, that's a great point. It's a great point that's being made there. So anything else on verse 26?
I'll add something there, Tom. I think sometimes, in fact, often Jesus says things in a way that are shocking, and I know that he was aware of that. So when he says, for instance, whoever would come to me must eat my flesh and drink my blood, he knew that was going to be shocking to the people. And when he says, if anyone asks you for your tunic, give him your coat also, or if that those are things that are hard to hear. And do not resist the one who is evil. And here's one that says you have to hate your mother and father. And it's tough, and I think he knows that it's difficult, but I think the point should be it stops us kind of in your tracks, and you kind of cock your head to the side and say, what is he saying here? And I think I agree with the application you guys are making, but I think that it would have been surprising to his original audience, and it's still surprising today, because we know that God says honor your father and mother, and so how do you say you must hate your father and mother? And the explanation that as you continue in the context, I think where we're going next, it begins to see the point that exactly what Stephen said. You have to be prepared for even the severing of those relationships, which to the world might look like hate. Sometimes people say, well, you're being hateful, and when we're following what the Bible says, but regardless of how it might appear, we have to always put the Lord first.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the point that Jesus is getting at in this entire context. John, you guys have...
Real quick, Tom. I'm sorry. I'll walk away or stop talking here for a second. Loving Jesus allows for us to properly treat and behave the way that we should towards others, including our parents. But if we love our parents and not Jesus, there's no room in there for Jesus. Loving him, following him allows for us to behave the way that we're supposed to towards all others while putting him first. But if we love others first, there's no room for him in that. So something to think about.
Great point. I would even go to the point to say that loving Jesus requires you to love your wife or your spouse, to love your parents.
Exactly.
That's loving him is doing what he says, and he tells you how to act in these relationships. Right. So I'm glad you brought that up. That was floating around in my mind, and I slipped between points. So that's a great point.
It came out and came over, and I got it, so we're good.
Perfect. Well, exactly. Do we want to go to the great minds think alike?
No.
I guess I just did. So
we're about truth now.
Exactly. Since we're factoring truth. Yeah. Anyways, verse 27. Actually, Jesus wraps us up. One of the things he does make the point that if you hate your own life, and he says, you cannot be my disciples if you do these things. And then in verse 27, he talks about whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Brian, did you have a thought on that?
I think it's a very interesting observation. This is the second time in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus makes this statement. It's interesting because the cross was such a stigma of violence or death. For us today, what we think of course, is the cross and Jesus's great sacrifice on it. But at that moment, that wasn't on anybody's mind. So sometimes when we look at this, we think of the idea, not inappropriately, that perhaps what Jesus is saying, we have burdens to bear, we have things we have to go through. Certainly there's other places in the Bible that establish that idea. Galatians 6, verse 5 is one of many places. However, I can't help but to think that here Jesus isn't so much talking about the day-to-day burdens. I think he's talking about death. I think Jesus is saying, because right before this, he says you even have to hate your own life. Then he says you have to take up your cross. And I can't help but to wonder if that imagery is meant to invoke the idea that when we put on Christ, we put on a lifestyle that's looking at our own death, our mortality. The fact that we're in a limited way in this world, that everything we live for is actually in our death, that everything we're looking for is in the next life. So our death is put on us, and we're bearing it all the time. We're bearing the limitation of our lives so that we might go forward into death. So I thought maybe I would just suggest a different way of looking at that it might be, and as I said, it's not inappropriate to say it's about our day-to-day burdens, but maybe he's also talking about the idea of hating our own life, that the idea is when we put on Christ, we put on a sense of death. We put on a death of ourselves to the world. We're dying daily. The old man is being put away. All the language of obedience to the gospel.
A living sacrifice.
Yeah, living sacrifice. Very good. So I just thought that might be a different way of looking at that, Steve.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And then you tie in the Revelation 2:10. Be faithful unto death. So you have that. So you have here the idea of being willing, like you said, bear your cross, whether you're dealing with specifically suffering or even to the point of death. Jesus is making that's the degree to which we have to love him and quote unquote hate everyone and everything else. And that's the point. And following this, Jesus gives two illustrations of this is a serious This is a serious challenge. And that's kind of the point that he makes when he gives, which of you intending to build a tower, you sit down first and you count the cost. How much is it going to cost me to do this? I think of our governments, how whenever they go to do a project, they project a cost, but how often is it that they fail to properly count the cost, or things get in the way and the project either balloons or it blows up and it doesn't get completed. Sadly, the average person in the business world doesn't have the resources of the government. And it's possible that you plan to do something, and if you haven't carefully waited ahead of time, when you get to work, it blows up because you haven't anticipated and made preparation for a setback or forgot to add something into it. And you may have a project that stands incomplete for a length of time. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that, a building that was supposed to be built and it just stays half built for however long, maybe never gets completely completed because something else happens. And so that's the challenge where Jesus is saying you need to count the cost. This is not playing around. The second illustration is the man going to war. A king, if you're going to go to war, don't do it foolishly. You need to make a determination ahead of time. I can win this. If you don't think you can win the war, even though you're outnumbered 2-1, and that's kind of the illustration that's given here, the best thing you can do is humble yourself, make peace with that other king, and you know what? Save your lives and save your country, save whatever's involved from that standpoint. So take these things seriously. Any other thoughts on that? Anybody else? Okay. Well, good. So we can get this wrapped up. One quick observation I want to make, and I actually did an invitation on this last week, based on reading through this on Wednesday night. And that is the fact, when you think about counting the cost, what you give up, number one. Number two, think about what you receive when you follow after Christ. You may lose your family. You may lose your father and mother. But think of the fathers and mothers you will receive in the Lord's body. I think Jesus talked about that in other places. And the other thought that comes to my mind with that is think of the cost if you choose not to accept this. So there's a lot of factors associated with counting the cost. Count the cost of the blessings of doing it, but count the cost of not accepting it. And that's the condemnation, the eternal condemnation and everything associated with that. So that's kind of my brief summary of that. Any other thoughts there? Okay, if not, we got two more verses. Jesus again talks about salt. Salt is good, but if it loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned, or how shall it season things? And it said it's good for nothing. It's not good for the land, the dunghill. Men throw it out. And then you have the warning to hear. What are your all thoughts on Jesus putting this in here at the conclusion of this admonition here? Or does it apply to this?
Well, these teachings, Tom, that he's been talking about have been things that have been talking to them about being total disciples, entirely giving themselves to Christ, entirely following him. And in thinking about that, someone who's lukewarm or half-hearted does not represent Christ well to those in the world or to Christ himself. And to be the people with the purpose and the influence that Christ wants us to be, we have to be totally devoted.
Yeah, exactly. And quite honestly, I look at these two verses, and these are the verses that tell me that Jesus is dealing with these corrupt religious leaders and the nation of Israel as a whole. They should have been the salt and the influence of the world when Jesus comes along. They should have been the one standing behind him and propelling him, projecting him to the world. But they're the ones who have rejected him. They had the word of God. They lost it. It lost its flavor.
Yeah.
What good is it going to be? It's good for nothing but to be thrown out. And I'm thinking that Jesus is talking here. You know, he's talking the rejection of the temple when Jesus dies, or at the temple, the veil being torn in two, and ultimately 70 AD. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The law is going to be done. And that's the ultimate point that he's driving home here. But certainly we have all the lessons on influence. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, if not, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there.
You must have
What's
made
that?
Brian mad, because he stormed off and looks like he's decided to come back again.
Well, that's good. So what's your final point there, then, Brian?
I don't know what we've been talking about.
No, we're talking about salt. Now, anyways, so we're done with it. With that, we'll just wrap up this chapter. And thank you, everybody, for your comments dealing with this. And I turn it over to you, John.
All righty. Thank you, Tom. All right. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. We appreciate your attention, and we appreciate you joining us for our study today. We've got a couple of things ourselves that we're going to talk about in trying to tweak future studies. Ultimately, what our goal is to make a study that is not hard to listen to, but something that you can follow along with and maybe be benefited by, something that you can take home with. I think sometimes studies can be like this, can become very laborsome. And what we would like to do is make sure that we are fitting a need here, both for ourselves, obviously, because we're doing this for us, but also for you, and trying to approach it in a way that will help you to retain and remember and be able to listen and say, yeah, I walked away very benefited by that study. So there's some things we're going to talk about amongst ourselves. Also, I'm hoping to get rid of the chat roll and install a free chat room that I think is available. So if you join us next week and the chat system looks a little bit different, just bear with us. If there's any special instructions, we'll tell you, but I don't think there will be. And of course, we'll be there at Facebook as well. All right, any other final thoughts before we pull this study to a close? Paul, I'll start with you.
No, I don't have anything. Appreciate Tom's work on Luke 14. He put in a lot of effort in that, and appreciate the good study.
Absolutely. Brian?
Nothing to add. It was a great study. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Eric?
No excuse that we could think of will be a good excuse when it comes to choosing to follow the Lord.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Tom, any final thoughts?
Yeah, and again, thanks to everybody. Take following after Christ seriously. That's the point that Jesus continues to drive home, and he gets stronger about it as we go on. So
Exactly.
Glad to lead this, and look forward to next week.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All righty. Well, Lord willing, we'll plan to continue our study. We will be in Luke chapter 15. We're going to be back here again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
12 noon in the Eastern time zone.
9 a.m. Pacific time.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
It's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.